So we want to discuss a few things today. What is Zhuangzi? Some of the main themes. What can Zhuangzi tell us about Chinese society and culture? And what is the impact of Zhuangzi on contemporary philosophy? And so we're trying to take you something that's relatively straightforward and simple and introductory at the beginning, and to be something a little bit more philosophical in nature at the end. And we hope that you find this useful. And then we will finish with our audience participation element. So if we can go on to the next slide, we're going to have a few introductions. And so let's straight away go to introduce Professor Lincoln Rathnam. So next slide, please. Great. So it's great for you to have you here, Lincoln, above and below. I see you managed to wear the same. Lincoln only has one tie.
I
do. So just by way of introduction, I think all of us have a way in which we first encountered Zhuangzi. Maybe you could tell us how did you first encounter Zhuangzi? What appealed to you about the text?
Sure, thank you.
Yeah,
this is working.
Yeah.
All right, excellent. So my first encounter with Zhuangzi came when I was an undergraduate student, and I was studying philosophy, and I had decided to write this sort of thesis with a bioethicist. And so he was an advisor to hospitals on what you should do with various ethical dilemmas of how to deal with premature babies and so forth. And so my thesis was about the question of how we should think about ethically issues concerning the genetic modification of children. Whether we should try and eliminate the sort of genetic basis for certain kinds of diseases, or try and cultivate children with superhuman strength or something like this. And one time we were talking about this, and the professor said to me, back in the day when I was a student myself, I was interested in studying Chinese philosophy. And I changed my mind and studied bioethics. But I think that this question calls for us to read Zhuangzi. So he got up and he found his dusty Zhuangzi volume and brought it down. And he pulled out a particular story. Story of Hundun. This comes at sort of the end of the inner chapters, the kind of early core element of the text. And it tells the story of three friends. And so they're not normal friends. One is named Chaos and is the ruler of this central region. One is the ruler of a northern region, and one is the ruler of a southern region. The other two are named Sudden and Brief, I think, translating into English. And apparently, they all get together periodically, Zhuangzi tells us, in the middle region where this Hundun, this Chaos character, lives. And so his two friends are so grateful for this sort of warm hospitality that apparently Hundun is showing them, that they say, well, this sort of chaotic friend of ours lacks proper bodily orifices. He's just chaos. He doesn't have a nose or eyes or ears or any of the things that one might expect. And so they said, let's drill him something. So they get out their ancient drills and so forth, and then they say, well, we'll make 7 holes. Make nose, eyes, and so on. And then Zhuangzi tells us on the 7th day, Hundun died. And so I don't know exactly what the reason why this story was being brought up in this context, but I take it that the professor with whom I was speaking thought that Zhuangzi was trying to say something about the limits of our knowledge of what's good for other people, and that this sort of sense that we should impose kind of physical standards on others on the basis of our own perception of what's good or right can lead to sort of disastrous, unintended results. And at the time, I just thought this was such an interesting story. And it's only a few lines, so it's much briefer even than my somewhat long-winded explanation would suggest. But also just that it was sort of a bizarre story, and that it was a text that I wanted to spend more time looking at. So one thing led to another, and then I kept doing it for, on and off for, I guess, 17 years or something. But in any case, that's how I first came into contact with this text. How about yourself, James?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Lincoln. Maybe go to the next slide, just in case you don't know what I look like. I lost my tie, so that's so I'm a scholar of Taoism, and my main research area today is in Taoist religion, and I have most of my research today really concerns the way what Taoism tells us about human beings in relation to the natural environment. That's really one of my main research topics. And I first came across Zhuangzi many years ago when I was struggling to learn classical Chinese. And the first text that they gave us to read was book 6 of Mencius, Mengzi. And I thought, okay, this I can understand. That's good. It tells a story. Mengzi goes to see King Hui of Yang, and that I can understand. And then the next thing they made us read was chapter 17 of Zhuangzi, the autumn floods story. And I had no idea what this was. I'd never read anything like this, and I was sure I didn't really understand it, but I was kind of fascinated by it. And in retrospect, I think one of the things that continues about Zhuangzi to inspire me to reread it is the way in which so many truths are taught through animals, through nature, through spirits, through the non-human realm. And one of the main themes that constantly appeals to me in Zhuangzi is that knowledge is not just contained by human beings, right? Knowledge is something that extends beyond the human realm, and maybe the animals, the trees, the waters, these things can be our teachers. And this is, I think, perhaps a kind of fairly sharp rebuke of the kind of Confucian ideas. We must respect our human teachers. Knowledge is transmitted in and through human societies. And Zhuangzi introduces us to an other than human world, or maybe a more than human world, that has a certain kind of wisdom to it. And to me, this is a kind of deeply intriguing idea that goes against the idea of a kind of human exceptionalism. We are somehow the masters of the universe, the owners of all of the virtue and the idea. And I think in an age like today, where we realize in effect, the lack of knowledge or the lack of wisdom that we have about engaging with issues in the natural world, such as climate change, global warming, we realize that what we think about the relationship between human beings and the natural world, there's something wrong with it or something flawed with it. And Zhuangzi, I think, can point out some of the flaws, but also to ridicule and mock us human beings for pretending that we know really what is going on in the world. So that has been some of my introduction, my background to Zhuangzi. So if we go on to the next slide, please. I think for me, one of the bad habits of academics is they want to put everything in boxes. So what is Zhuangzi? What kind of a thing is it? And is it a kind of philosophy? Is it a kind of mysticism? It's a kind of literature. What kind of a thing is it? So Lincoln, you're a political philosopher. So maybe let's think about the philosophy box. How is Zhuangzi philosophy? Well, how would you characterize that? Maybe let's go on to the next slide.
Right. I think that the difficulty of kind of categorizing it in this way is it sort of depends for us, especially if you're an academic, maybe less so if you're just someone who's enthusiastic about Zhuangzi and starts reading it. It doesn't really, you don't have to say I'm reading it as an X or a Y. But I think that when philosophers tend to approach Zhuangzi, it's in order to answer certain sorts of philosophical questions that persist across a lot of different traditions. So you can have, for example, people in epistemology, the study of knowledge, thinking about some of the stories in which Zhuangzi calls into question whether we really know what we think we know. We'll see in a minute his famous story about a man dreaming that he's a butterfly, but then he doesn't know if he's actually a butterfly, dreaming that he's a man once he wakes up. So, this is just a story that's interesting. You can approach it from a kind of literary dimension, but philosophers have tended to say, well, what is his position about how we obtain self-knowledge, or whether we can obtain a certain kind of knowledge of what sort of things we are. As we'll also discuss in a little while, philosophers have also read a lot of ethical conclusions in the Zhuangzi about how we should treat other people, how we should feel about difference and disagreement with other people, about the proper way in which to respond to death, the proper way in which to live our lives. But the challenge there is that it's not really set up like a classical philosophical text that one who's trained in a kind of Western philosophical tradition might expect. It's not at all like, say, an Aristotle or Kant, making a kind of argument in a series of points in which, the conclusions clearly follow from the premises. It's really about stories and sort of stories of conversations between people, or stories of weird creatures interacting with one another. So there's always a sort of sense, I think, that, one can approach it with a sort of philosophical lens. The way in which the text is constructed seems to point beyond that to a sort of broader reading that also introduces literary and religious other elements. What do you make of this?
Funny you should ask me that. It may be a little bit different to Zhuangzi if you go into the next slide. I really came to Zhuangzi as a scholar of religion, and it's not evident that Zhuangzi is something like a religious text or is teaching a kind of religious doctrine, but Zhuangzi was certainly accepted within the religious Taoist tradition as being a kind of enlightened master. And this text here, the Zhuangzi was given this official title of the Naohua Zhenjing, the true scripture of Naohua. It was incorporated into the corpus of Taoist religious texts that was collected and then eventually published in the Zhangtong era of the Ming Dynasty, and I think most people today might be a little bit surprised to think about Zhuangzi as a kind of religious text, but there are to me intriguing religious elements to Zhuangzi. So this starts first of all in there's a kind of mystical element, or let's say that there is some kind of knowledge that transcends what human beings ordinarily can obtain. There's something more to the world than we imagine in our kind of prosaic, mundane kind of mind. And I think that opens the reader to a kind of sensibility that that our ordinary rational way of perceiving the world is perhaps not enough. And Zhuangzi is always pushing people to go beyond what they think they know about things. Then, secondly, in Zhuangzi, there are lots of interesting characters who are in relation to each other as teachers. And so there'll be passages sometimes start so-and-so told so-and-so, who told so-and-so, who told so-and-so. And this kind of genealogy suggests that there was at least a kind of tradition or a community of people who passed on some kind of knowledge, from one generation to another, that perhaps pre-existed Zhuangzi. So it points to there's some kind of lineage or a tradition of a school of thought or way of doing things that goes from one generation to another. And then thirdly and finally, there are clearly some kinds of spiritual practices in Zhuangzi. So there's one called the breathing through the heels, which is perhaps some kind of qi practice or Qi meditation technique. We don't really know what this is. And then another one, Zhuangzi, the sitting down and forgetting, which suggests a certain kind of seated meditation where you try to deliberately unlearn the conventional ways of thinking about things that you have somehow learned in your normal kind of existence. So there's indications of like traditions or schools of teachers. There's certain kinds of non-discursive practices that might be akin to certain kinds of meditative activities. And later, the Zhuangzi was kind of canonized as a kind of a saint, if you like, within the Taoist tradition. And if we can if we can plug the computer back in and go on to the next screen, I think we just had up there just a very famous poem by Li Bai about Zhuangzi dreaming of being a butterfly, and I think this points to maybe this literary element. Zhuangzi is clearly a text of very high literary value and was also recognized as such and incorporated in the kind of literary tradition in China. So this poem of Li Bai begins with this famous story in Zhuangzi dreamed of being a butterfly, or perhaps the butterfly dreamed of being Zhuangzi. And then Li Bai goes on to make a poem about this, ending with this: why spend so much time and effort striving after these things that are transitory or always in a process of transformation? So, and I think this again is one of the kind of key themes in Zhuangzi. Nothing is kind of eternally fixed. Everything exists in a mode of transformation. It's something becoming something else. And that's the underlying nature of the world. Everything is in the process of becoming something else. And so one of the things that I think, for me feels very interesting about Zhuangzi, it's always trying to go somewhere else. It's trying to escape beyond its boundaries. And we see it even, and it's made its way into Western literature as well. Lincoln and I were just discussing this famous scene. Go and tell the story.
Yeah, so we were talking about Tom Stoppard's play, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which some of you may have seen. And at one moment, I remember I didn't know this was going to be in it, and I was watching it being performed in Toronto a while ago, and they were, and one of the characters is speaking, and he just starts reciting the story of the butterfly dream. And he says, there's this, roughly, I'm just paraphrasing it, but, there's a Chinese philosopher of the Tang Dynasty, which Zhuangzi isn't, but I think he's talking about the story. Li Bai is of the Tang Dynasty, so maybe that's what he's thinking of. But so he's saying, there's a philosopher of the Tang Dynasty who dreamed he was a butterfly, but he wasn't sure if he was really a butterfly, dreaming that he's a man. And we can envy him in his twofold security, whatever that means. I'll leave that for your interpretation. But I think because this image, or this sort of puzzle that's at the heart of the story, travels so easily across context. You don't need to be an ancient person or a Chinese person to understand this kind of questioning of the relationship between appearance and reality, and whether or not the way in which you experience the world is actually tracking the way it really is. So I think this is one of the reasons why the central themes and stories of Zhuangzi have recurred, not just in Chinese literature, but also, especially over the last couple of centuries, in Western literature as well.
So I think that one of the things, I'm always saying this, Zhuangzi somehow escapes. it's always running away from you, and it's something that has percolated across cultural bands. Is something that has persisted within Chinese culture, but nevertheless, of course, as I guess philosophers and academics like to kind of pin down some things and to think about what are some of the kinds of key themes that we find in the Zhuangzi. So I think in the next part of the talk, if we can have the next slide, we want to focus a little bit in detail about one particular story, and the story is the one that we printed inside the. So now we're all in church. We must read the Bible. The story that has been printed. It's one of the perhaps one of the most famous stories in the Zhuangzi about the useless tree. I'm not going to read it all out today, but maybe you can just read through that a little bit now, and maybe we can recount a little bit of the story. Actually, in Zhuangzi, I think there are 2 or 3 stories about useless trees. So maybe Lincoln, can you just refresh our memories about some of the basic features of the story?
Yeah.
Let's discuss some of the content.
Absolutely. So this is a story about a carpenter and his apprentice who are wandering around. And of course, as carpenters, they're very interested in finding attractive trees that they can use for their various construction projects. And they come across an enormous tree, which is described in your bulletin here. And the apprentice is sort of amazed and saying, wow, there's people looking at this tree. Everyone is just sort of entranced by its tremendous size and the fact that it has so much grandeur or something. And the carpenter says, oh, forget it. That's not the kind of tree we want. If we were to build something with it, it would fall apart. It's not suitable for what we want to do. So presumably the apprentice is suitably reprimanded. They go on their way. And then the carpenter goes to bed and has a dream in which the tree appears to him to mock him and to point out what a paltry and pathetic little man he is. And so the tree comes to him and says, look, if you look at all of the trees that people like, the fructiferous trees, you have orange trees or whatever, those trees are always getting plucked, and people are going up and taking parts of them. People are cutting them down and doing things with them. And so ultimately what happens is that they're destroyed completely because of their usefulness for human beings. And he says, and look, but I, a useless tree, have existed for all this time, while maintaining my own sort of physical integrity. And you are just a person who's going to die soon. So who are you to criticize me? When my strategy seems to be the intelligent one. And so, that's sort of the general overview of the story. And of course, we can discuss what that might mean.
And maybe, I always hate to think, I feel like when my students, well, what does this mean? The students, well, what does that mean? and maybe instead of answering the question in that way, I think, we picked this story because it seems to highlight many different themes that recur throughout Zhuangzi in different ways. And so I think maybe let's talk about utility, right, as one of the obvious themes in this story. So maybe Lincoln, you can comment a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, as James mentions, this is one of a sort of set of stories in the Zhuangzi, and both including this tree theme and others, in which there's a questioning of the idea that sort of dominant social ideals about what's good or useful are, in fact, good for the people who possess them. And so it seems then that the suggestion here is that somehow, at least one suggestion that one might take from it, as James said, we should be wary of, thinking we know exactly what such a strange story that goes unexplained in the text really means. But there seems to be a questioning of the idea that what people tell you is useful and good is actually, so. I mean, we also have stories in the text of people who suffer from physical disabilities and are sort of marginalized in society, or people who have been punished for crimes by having their foot cut off or something, and are sort of shunned for this reason. And Zhuangzi has some stories in which he shows that, because of this, they weren't sent to go and fight in some war, and they preserved their life, in spite of it. So there seems to be an idea that what's useful isn't actually particularly helpful for us, because it's not really useful for us. It's useful for somebody. perhaps the officials or your ruler or what have you.
I think that one of the things you mentioned there is the stories about the disabled people or disfigured people in some way. And one of the things that I think always intrigued me in those stories is how how these people appear in the stories as teachers. And like just as in this story, it's the tree that appears to be the teacher. And I think I was always I think one of the things that struck me when I was really first come across this is how often we have in our mind the idea that the person who conveys knowledge has to conform to some kind of physical appearance. So it has to look kind of attractive or authentic or knowledgeable. And our society is constructed around not just knowledge, for its own sake, but knowledge that's embodied in certain forms that appear to us to be authoritative in some way. And these kind of social expectations as to what we think the purveyors of knowledge look like are in fact deluding. We're actually led astray by our preconceived notions of what an authoritative teacher or a wise person or a knowledgeable person looks like. And what our societies do is elevate people who look like they are the people who ought to know things about things, right? And this appearance, and so we construct a kind of a political, a social world based on the appearances of things rather than on a kind of true knowledge or appearance. And I think this is a kind of very profound social critique, maybe even a political. I mean, you're a political philosopher, right? Lincoln, do you have anything to say about that?
Well, I mean, as we've been discussing, it's sometimes hard to know what Zhuangzi's intention is because we have stories. But I think that what I take to be one of the upshots of this sort of story is that these sorts of accounts of usefulness aren't just random. So it's not just that it's an epistemological critique where you say, well, it's not based on sound reasoning or something, so it's wrong in that way. Although he might think that too, but also that what people call useful is based on specific kinds of social standards that are developed for certain reasons. It's not a coincidence that people call this like an orange tree useful, and this sort of mangled tree or a more difficult to cut tree useless. It's because they like oranges, they like taking them off, they like cutting it down, whatever. And so I think that there's a sort of, there's both the epistemological critique and saying, well, do we really know what's useful? But also something of saying, well, don't you think this account of usefulness is really coming from sort of those in power or something of that nature, maybe? And
useful, I think it's like useful for, right? Whereas I think, one of the things that I think we see consistently in the theme in Zhuangzi is that things have their own ways, right, of their own intrinsic virtue, their own way in which to exist in the world, and that our the concept of utility threatens to distract something from its own kind of innate purpose or existence, and to corrupt it into something that is useful for some other purpose or for some other theme. And I think this is perhaps this is the maybe we could call it like the corrupting power of society, right? It that causes us to bend our own internal dynamics to the service of the systems and regimes in which we operate. And this is a kind of profoundly life-denying kind of activity. But what this, I think, leads to, perhaps this is a kind of a criticism that we might level about Zhuangzi, is that, well, we all have to live in the world, right? I mean, we can't get by without being useful in some way to other people. And that maybe, is this kind of criticism utility excessive, do you think? Or?
Right. I mean, we certainly hope this will be useful to you tonight. But I think that is one of the classic objections against Zhuangzi. Is that, it's fun when you're, if you're a poet like Levi and you're sitting here and you're, drinking like I think Levi is famous for doing, and you're sitting around and you're just thinking these thoughts, and it's really wild, and you have this crazy experience, and it's wonderful. But most people have to go to work and so forth, and they have to listen to whether their boss thinks they're being a useful employee and whatnot. So yeah, I do think it's a question of, just does Zhuangzi undermine just what people need to do to live in the world? And I mean, I suppose one way of thinking about it that comes up in a different chapter in the in the World of Men chapter is, in this chapter they situate Confucius as like a spokesman for Zhuangzi's ideas. I think people often think to sort of make fun of Confucius. And since this is a series on non-Confucian thought, right, so we should make fun of him to some extent.
We should always make fun of Confucius.
In a friendly manner. But in these stories, some people have these tasks that are very high stakes, like they need to go and try and educate some petulant young ruler's child. And they fear that if they're not able to carry off this task successfully, then they're going to be executed. Or they have to go and try and do some sort of negotiation with the ruler of a state. And what Confucius sort of parroting ideas that people sort of attribute to Zhuangzi, seems to suggest that they need to sort of purge themselves of their sort of grand projects, their personal ambitions, their desire for power, precisely because it's those things that lead people, on his view, into conflict with one another. So one thing that Zhuangzi's Confucius says, for example, is that if someone goes into these political negotiations just trying to get the upper hand or gain power or pursue their own ends, the other person will kind of detect this and respond in a hostile manner. And because their power is so asymmetrical, probably the ruler will win and this paltry interloper will suffer. And so I think there they suggest that you can kind of go through these tasks, but you want to kind of empty out. Maybe it's, James was mentioning this forgetting process, which I believe is one of the things that Zhuangzi's Confucius urges the people he's talking to do in this situation. Is to say, okay, you can go and do this, right? And you probably have to, because if the ruler tells you you're on a mission, you've got to go. But you want to do it in a way that you're not just pursuing all these personal projects that are going to lead you into excessive conflict with this person. So I think that there's some suggestion, whether it's realistic or not, that it's actually of some benefit in order to kind of get by, to get rid of some of these things that lead us into conflict and make us unhappy.
That's very fascinating. I wonder if that relates a little bit to this relationship between dreaming and reality, because sometimes we think about dreams as things that happen to us that allow us to process all of the things that have happened during our working days, and perhaps these dream states are the places that somehow, when this purging or this processing happens, somehow open us up to another kind of truth or reality that can somehow come to us in these like non-working, non-utilitarian moments. And that's a theme that appears in Zhuangzi many times. Yeah. And maybe one other thing, I think, for me, I think I mentioned before, humans are not the only purveyors of wisdom. So here, like the oak tree, the oak tree is the teacher. And I think this, for me, I think is relevant in the modern age. I think one of the things that has basically happened, since like the Enlightenment period in Europe, or let's say that was founded on a kind of humanistic principle of man as the measure of all things, intending to dethrone God as some kind of standard of authority or rationality. But the flip side of that is that it kind of established human beings as these kinds of exceptional creatures in the world, which presumably in some ways we are. But then, of course, since Darwin and so forth, this has been the kind of this idea about human beings are somehow exceptionally distinct from other species in the world, or even that intelligence, language, the more ethologists study the world of animals, the more we realize that the various kinds of intelligence exist within animals and non-human animals, and these things that we associate with human beings, such as the capacity for language and reasoning and even mathematics, are things that are found in various ways in other species in the world. So I think those of us who kind of grew up in this Western tradition, where we sort of imagined that human beings as somehow the final product, of the world, realize that this way of thinking, I think, is deeply flawed. So I don't see I mean, you can read these stories, of course, as being playful in some way and appealing and charming, but at the same time, I think they contain kind of powerful correctives to certain kinds of flaws that have emerged in the way we think about human beings and our place in the world. So that's. I don't know if there's another thing that you want to talk about the useless tree.
No, I think we've.
Okay, so we covered quite a lot of ground, and definitely want to leave time for to hear from you in the end. So let's move on to our next slide. Just to talk a little bit about Zhuangzi and Chinese culture, and we're especially interested to hear from you kind of about this as well. And if we just have a look at the next slide as well. This is I managed to find this on the internet this morning. This was a sacrifice at the Zhuangzi temple that took place in 2016, and I think this was from Xinhua or China Daily. I just wanted to show that to show somehow this Zhuangzi is at least in 2016 was a significant figure to have this large kind of ceremony take place. But I think that if we think about Zhuangzi in some way is, let's say, eccentric, right? Like that, and I think by that, like not the mainstream, perhaps, of what we imagine Chinese culture conventionally to consist of, and I think often we think about, especially if foreigners come to China, they must learn about Chinese culture or must learn about Confucianism. Confucianism somehow is the essence of Chinese culture, though of course. So how do we think about Zhuangzi or Taoism in relation to what we might consider like the mainstream or official culture of traditional China?
Well, I suppose that obviously anything that we say about this will be a generalization covering many centuries of official culture, but one suggestion which has always seemed to me to be plausible is from the sinologist A.C. Graham, and he says, well, look, he was trying to answer the question in this piece of, what is it that made the particular combination of sort of philosophical ideas in China so durable from ancient times through kind of the late imperial period. And one of the things he suggests is that it's the ability to combine a kind of official, public-minded culture as manifested in Confucianism with a kind of outlet for people's desire to be free of some of the trappings of that, or the ways or to be free of the ways in which the burdens that might be placed on one would kind of demand sacrifice. And so one example that we were discussing the other day is there's this poem from the poet Bai Juyi, and he was an official, and so in that sense a part of the official culture as well as a great and eminent poet. But during various, as often happened to these officials, during a sort of downswing of his career. He was sent to a remote place, and seemingly as a kind of punishment for some of his political projects. And he has a poem called Reading Zhuangzi, where he describes the idea of being isolated from his actual home and the people he associates with, but being able to kind of occupy this sort of like spiritual home, for lack of a better way of putting it, through thinking about Zhuangzi's ideas and reading this sort of radically challenging text. So that's one way of thinking about it, is that, in terms of its role in the broader culture, it gives people who, for some reason, are separated from public affairs or the expectations of the broader society and so forth, something that they can do in a way they can think about their situation that's fruitful and inspiring. And I think one interesting thing about that reading is that it makes some room for Zhuangzi to be doing something in Chinese culture other than just trying unsuccessfully to undermine Confucianism for many centuries. Because during this time, it's not as if the imperial system abandoned Confucius and took up the Zhuangzi as some sort of anarchist manifesto or something. It's just people kept studying Zhuangzi for their own pleasure and for other reasons. While simultaneously, this very different system of thought was kind of guiding higher level decision making and the society as a whole. So I think that's one important dimension of it, at least.
I think that goes to understanding. Again, forgive these kinds of generalizations. Chinese culture as kind of irreducibly complex, and I think this is one of the things that I think very often. I think maybe this is familiar to those of you as well. I think as a foreigner living in China, I'm always deeply distressed by the kind of misconceptions that foreigners have about Chinese culture and about what it's like to live in China today. And if you I think this partly comes from the fact that we sort of people are told to associate Chinese culture with it's something to do with this paternalistic Confucianism, deference to authority. The individual must sacrifice themselves for the family or for the state, and this kind of combines with some kind of paranoid understanding of what communism means to create this kind of reading of Chinese society in the minds of foreigners as a place that is completely lacking in freedom. And when if I think about who is the paramount philosopher of freedom, it's Zhuangzi, right? And so how can this be, right? And it's simply because societies are complex. They're not just one thing. They're things and something else. And I think it's very hard, perhaps for outsiders, to see that yes, there is all of this. Some of these are stereotypes about Chinese culture. The importance of the family and the state and so forth. That those are all true. But at the same time, people aren't unfree, right? And there's perhaps certain kinds of radical ways that people can be free here that are quite different from things in the West. And I think that if we understand that our cultures can be more than one thing at the same time, and that to understand Chinese history, you have to think about not just Confucianism, but also Buddhism, Taoism, the impact of the West as well. Of course, it's this incredibly rich and complex thing that is actually quite difficult to disentangle and kind of disengage. So let's go on to the end, and I want to talk about finally, on our somewhat whistle-stop tour through Zhuangzi. We can go on to the next couple of slides here to think about Zhuangzi and contemporary philosophy. So, and I think here the point basically I want to make is that although the Zhuangzi was compiled 2,300 or so years ago, or maybe 1,700 years ago in the edition that people normally use today, Zhuangzi is still a philosopher who is debated and is of relevance in kind of contemporary philosophical thinking, and and also European and American philosophical thinking as well, and maybe and Western philosophers, perhaps since the 19th century or 18th, maybe even earlier, when they first began to learn about Taoist thought, Lao Tzu and the Zhuangzi translated into English, developed a kind of fascination with these things, and this has had a kind of impact on the trajectory of philosophy in the West. So, and maybe we can start to tell a little bit of that story with Heidegger.
Sure. Yeah. So
I leave the Heidegger to him. He's the expert.
We're not beginning with Heidegger because Heidegger is the first person who was interested in this text, but perhaps in a way to indicate the broad range of people who have been interested in the West, in Zhuangzi, and the text attributed to him. So on the one hand, you have someone like Heidegger, who apparently became interested in it, I think, through studying a German translation of Martin Buber. And allegedly, some people posit that certain key elements of his philosophy are inspired by his reading of these texts, which I don't think we really know, but we do know that he was very interested in it. Interested in Zhuangzi and interested in the Tao Te Ching, the text attributed to Lao Tzu, and therefore in Taoism sort of generally. And it seems that one of the reasons why he wanted to do this was he held the belief that Western philosophy had kind of gone in the wrong direction since ancient times, and it had somehow prevented people from sort of really grasping the experience of being itself. And what he means by that, I won't venture to even try to explain now, mostly because I don't think I can do it well. But part of his project of getting outside of these assumptions that he thought were misleading Western people was to study these non-Western texts, and therefore, in a way, to learn from them in sort of the highest sense. Now, of course, as many of you probably know, Heidegger was part of this sort of very sinister turn and joined the Nazi Party in Germany. And so whatever he was doing with Zhuangzi, he apparently interpreted in a way that was consistent with his broader thought. But a lot of the way that people use Zhuangzi today when they're studying him in philosophy departments, but also elsewhere, is, as James was suggesting, as a kind of theorist of freedom. And therefore as someone who can kind of speak to some of the concerns that people in Western sort of philosophical contexts are interested in. So if you take someone like John Rawls, probably the most famous American philosopher of the 20th century, says, okay, the two principles are freedom and equality. And this is true for many modern Western political philosophers. And you certainly wouldn't say that that's true about someone like Confucius or Xunzi or maybe not even Zhuangzi. So people say, well, so where do you kind of create a dialogue there between, on the one hand, these sorts of modern Western thinkers, and on the other hand, figures within the Chinese tradition? And so a lot of people go to Zhuangzi in this way, looking to say, well, actually there is this sort of history in classical Chinese thought and in strands of Chinese thought that were influenced by that earlier period, that are very concerned with kind of creating a space for individual freedom and living a life that's independent of what others expect of you, and so forth. So this is true both for sort of Western philosophers who are looking at Zhuangzi, but also sometimes for some Chinese philosophers who try and engage in dialogue with these 20th century or later Western thinkers. And I guess one Did you want to say anything more about
no.
I guess the third point that we wanted to mention. Oh yeah. Sorry.
No. I was just going to kind of sum up. I think the first two. I think maybe to re-articulate this, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong because you know a lot more about this than I do. But I think in terms of the way in which our kind of Western philosophical tradition has been misled is through a kind of emphasis on abstractions and ideals, rather than the kind of concrete particularities of living in the world. And I think that I think one of the things that we can certainly say as a kind of preoccupation of Zhuangzi is what does it mean to live, right? This kind of living life or having life. It's something that we all have, but do we actually know what it means to live? That's actually a very, very kind of deep question that is in a way irreducibly particular. It's not. I mean, of course, it's all shaded by the finality of death, but the particularity of my life and what living means for me, I think, can't be the same as what it is for you, simply because of our locatedness, right? We're in different places, we're in different contexts, and that is and what it means to live in that particular place can't easily be abstracted or generalized, I think, right? And I think this is why this connection to freedom is so important, because freedom is not an abstract thing, right? It's that what it means for me to be free depends precisely on the concrete circumstances of my life. And what that means for me is not the same for you, and it's not the same for me when I was a child, and it's not the same for me when I'm an older person. And it's very hard to generalize about what freedom means. It's something that has to be lived, experienced, gone through. And that is something that I can learn from in my own life, but I would be very hard pressed to tell you what to do, or to tell you how to live your life. So this radical deference to the insistence that our way of living in the life is deeply particular. It's deeply about how we see the world from our own perspective. I think is this deferential trait is something that I think is a very powerful ethical principle. So I can't tell you what to do, right? It's not for me to do that. And it's the opposite perhaps of the kind of maybe the more kind of Christian idea of do what you do unto others as you would have them do unto us. This is more like the opposite, like don't do to other people. I think this just pause for a second and don't impose yourself immediately on whatever it is that's going on around you is, I think, a profoundly ethical way of living in the world.
Yeah, I mean, and that connects well to this initial story we were discussing of Hundun's friends trying to help him in a way by drilling all these holes because they figured, well, it's too bad that he doesn't have them. But in fact, they were actually doing something quite destructive. And I mean, just what James was saying also reminded me of a feature that you probably noticed if you've read the text, which is that certainly unlike something like Christianity, where there's a clear model of what sort of the best possible life would be like, but also contrary to something like Confucianism, where Confucius is a kind of model, and the exemplary way in which he behaves towards other people is something that, if you admire him, you can look at and say, wow, there really are beautiful things that he's done in certain situations that I would like to be able to do. Zhuangzi doesn't really give us any image of somebody who's sort of the perfect guy, or even someone who's very far along on the right track in a way that could be modeled. there are stories about, he'll reference the Zhuangzi, this sort of perfected, completed person. But it's never to say, okay, well, here are the 10 things they do. It's often to speak sort of metaphorically about them, like, what if they were invulnerable to the cold or something? And so it seems like the composition of the text there kind of matches the philosophical points that James is raising, in that it doesn't say, okay, here's what you're supposed to do if you are, the perfect Zhuangist. And even the way they present, later chapters present Zhuangzi himself, and the butterfly story does too, but not really in a way that's saying, oh, you should act like this. He's just presented doing ordinary things, like having dreams. He goes fishing sometimes. He tries to avoid getting sort of drafted into public service. But it's not as if he's presented as being this kind of amazing superhuman who you should just kind of, oh, he likes fishing, so I should go fishing too,